So it's my great honor to moderate a panel of all of these giants in Detroit's local food system. Today we will be talking about access to food and food sovereignty. But before we do that, I'm going to give you a little bit of a longer intro for all of our panelists. So Devita Davison is the executive director of Food Lab, a membership-based nonprofit that fosters the creation of an inclusive and equitable local food economy. Her organization supports local food entrepreneurs of color by providing them with training, technical assistance, and access to market opportunities. Malik Yakini is the co-founder and executive director of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. They operate a 7-acre farm on Detroit's west side, and they're also spearheading the opening of a co-op grocery store. And he views the good food revolution as part of a larger movement for freedom, justice, and equality. And is also passionate and very interested in an international food sovereignty movement that embraces Black communities in the Americas, Caribbean, and Africa. Kami Pothukuchi is Distinguished Service Professor of Urban Studies and Planning at Wayne State University here in Detroit. Her research has explored local linkages between the food system and the economy, built-in natural environment, health and equity. She's a founding member of the Detroit Food Policy Council and has written extensively on urban agriculture, food retail, and food planning. She's also the founding director of Seed Wayne, a campus community sustainable food system collaborative in the city. So to kick us off, I'm sorry, I always forget to introduce myself. I'm not that important. I'm Alex Hill. I currently work for the Detroit Health Department as the Chronic Disease and Injury Prevention Program Manager, and have played a role in some food things here, just supporting. So I have had the pleasure to work and talk with our panelists very often, but I'm going to try to do less talking today. So I know the theme for the conference is access, and access to food is our panel, but we're also trying to talk about food sovereignty. So I'd like you all to begin as introduction. How do you talk about access to food versus food sovereignty in the work that you do?
Testing. Oh, it is on. Great. So Baba Malik handed me the mic. I guess you want me to go first to answer the question. Oh, men go first. Thank you so much. Kill the patriarchy, I guess. So smash it. Absolutely. So the question, Alex, is how do I think about access and food sovereignty in the work that I do?
Right, yep. Kind of, do you pair those together? Are they
between
different?
the two,
Yeah.
right? So the work that I do at Food Lab Detroit, as Alex indicated, is we're a nonprofit organization that supports food entrepreneurs. And we help those entrepreneurs launch, in many cases, sustainably grow and scale their food business. And Food Lab is a community-based organization, a membership-based organization that consists of almost 185 locally owned food businesses. And the majority of our member businesses, 78% of our member businesses, are folks of color. And about 53% are African American. And that's super important to understand that demographic in terms of how I look at access and sovereignty. So access to me is all about choice, right? Having access, availability, the ability to choose. And so how I look at my work is really from a systemic and institutional racist framework, and understanding that in many of the communities where the entrepreneurs that we serve live every day, don't have access to healthy, fresh food, don't have access to healthy food retail. And I understand that that is of no fault of their own. that many of the neighborhoods in Detroit that are labeled, and I do not like this word, but I am going to use it as defined by the USDA, food deserts. We like to call it food apartheid because we think it is deliberate. But many of these neighborhoods don't have access to healthy, fresh food. It's because the neighborhoods that they live in have been segregated, redlined, and resources have been exploited from those communities and placed in another community. So they don't even have the resources, which leads me to sovereignty. And so if you know that your government has legally and strategically taken resources out of your community, in many cases, communities occupied by Black and brown bodies, and even many cases use those resources to help build out outer ring suburbs in Detroit, what do you do in order to make sure that you can still provide your babies, your family, your neighbors, yourself with healthy, fresh food? And that leads us into sovereignty. And sovereignty is all about power. Sovereignty is all about control, where you no longer want to be dependent upon our globalized food system to provide you with healthy, fresh food. Sovereignty is about you controlling the food system yourself and controlling what food shows up on your kitchen table and on your plate every day, because you're growing that food yourself, or you're building your own local businesses in your community and neighborhood that's owned by the people who live in that neighborhood. So that's what it looks like to me.
Um, so I'm an urban planner by training, and over these last couple of decades, I've been thinking about what does it mean to bring a planning perspective, and especially a community and regional planning perspective, to food, and how can you use planning as a tool for both food access and sovereignty. By food sovereignty, I understand it to mean food by the people, for the people, and of the people. That is it's a large understanding. And so then what does it mean translated on the ground is a question that I'm always asking. But planning is, so bringing a planning lens or a planning attention to food means looking at the resources at the community level in which we work, and connecting the food system to all the other systems, land, economy, health, etc. And then when you ask questions about access, which are very important questions in Detroit and many other communities, both urban and rural, you have to look at the history of abandonment and exclusion. And so you have to, part of our figuring out a solution to planning is starting with the problems that community members face. And if community members don't have grocery stores in their neighborhood that are accessible to them, or if they have to take 2 buses in order to access a distant supermarket, then the question as a planner becomes, well, how do you bring that access into the neighborhood? There are a range of options available to a planner. That you can talk to supermarkets to attract them to the inner city, to the neighborhood. You can think about how to connect people to sources of fresh, healthy food by farmers markets. So then the question is, how can you attract local farmers into the city and help the producers and the eaters link to each other and thereby increase access to food? And also it is about thinking about land as a resource so that people can grow their own food as well. And so trying to understand that through the lens of sovereignty means that when you have land, you have to look at it from the perspective of how it can be used to serve people's needs, not in terms of the market. So you have to talk about land from the perspective of the user and its use value as opposed to the exchange value. And also, in trying to think about reducing the dependence, even though supermarkets are an important part of this toolbox, if you want to reduce dependence on outside sources and increase the capacity locally, then you have to work to build the local connections, the local connections that build the chains that constitute the food system, right from production through the processing and the sales and the consumption, and then back, the managing the wastes back into the system to create a loop as locally as possible. I'm going to stop there. I have some more things to say, but I want to give.
So first, it's a pleasure to be on a panel with these two brilliant women, Devita and Kami. And it's a pleasure to be on a panel moderated by Alex, who's done tremendous work, even though he's kind of underselling himself today. So I lead the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. And access is a really important question in a place like Detroit for all of the reasons that Devita and Kami have just laid out. Our organization takes the position that access to high quality, healthy food is a human right. That regardless of your economic standing, regardless of your so-called race, that as a result of being a human being on this earth, you have the right to high quality food. And so that kind of grounds our work. There is a tremendous problem with access in the city of Detroit, and some people like to use the word food desert, which I also don't like to use, because it doesn't speak to the intentionality. We've had tremendous disinvestment in the city of Detroit, which is largely tied up with race in America. In fact, you really can't understand anything in Detroit if you don't understand how race plays out here. So there is a tremendous access problem in the city of Detroit, which has severe health implications for Detroiters. And it also means that many Detroiters who have automobiles are spending money outside of the city of Detroit, going to grocery stores in the ring of suburbs surrounding Detroit, which again extracts money from our community and puts it into communities that surround us, where that same money, if we were able to capture it and circulate it, would be the kind of fuel that we need to build not only an independent food system, to the extent that you can have anything that's independent, really, but also to build the other kind of institutions that we need to have a healthy and vibrant community. On the question of sovereignty, it is, as Kami said brilliantly, and you might have said this too, tied up with the question of power. And so it's my view that you really can't have food sovereignty unless you have sovereignty in general. And so part of our work as an organization is to kind of reignite the sense of agency within people in our community. Living in an oppressive society that suggests to people that there are experts that should do things for them diminishes the sense that we have of our ability to do things for ourselves and the responsibility that we have to do things for ourselves. So the beginning for us of food sovereignty is igniting within the people this understanding of their right as human beings to control every aspect of their life, including the food system that provides their food. And it's also tied up with the question of land, because the vast majority of food on the planet now is grown on the earth. I mean, there's some innovations now where people are growing food in buildings and on rooftops and vertical gardens, but the vast majority of food is still grown or raised on the ground. And so those who have access to the earth, are usually the ones that have greater control over the food system. And so this plays out both in rural areas, such as the southern part of the United States, where Black farmers have been systematically dispossessed of land over the last 100 years or so or more. But it also plays out in urban areas like Detroit, where we see so-called land ownership. And I say so-called because I really push back heavily against the whole idea of land ownership. I think it's a European construct that came to us from European feudal societies that we pretty much accept unquestioningly. But it plays out in a place like Detroit, where you have very wealthy white men who own the vast majority of the land and buildings in the most highly concentrated areas of the city. For example, the businesses owned by Dan Gilbert own more than 100 buildings in downtown Detroit. And so if we're truly going to have food sovereignty, then we also have to have kind of a redistribution of land, more equitable access to land, but also we need capital. And this is a huge problem too, because even if you have land and you don't have capital to develop that, then you're not going to go anywhere. So fundamentally, to summarize, food sovereignty is connected to the ideas of power, of land, of capital, and of people having a sense of agency as human beings to determine their own destiny.
Excellent. I think a great theme that you've all kind of touched on is this the opportunity that Detroiters have with food. And I think we could easily define access more broadly, as all of you have, in thinking about access to things like capital, the business process in the city, land process in the city. Could you all touch on some of those, I guess, experiences and maybe struggles as it relates to these different access points, both in your work and the people you've worked with?
Well, I'll give a couple examples just based on my experience with working with food entrepreneurs. Some, would you call them access points? And so I think that to piggyback on what Baba Malik said about Mr. Gilbert owning over 100 buildings downtown, which arguably the 7.2 square miles of greater downtown is probably where the most density is in the city of Detroit. And so it wouldn't surprise my panelists and it wouldn't surprise folks in the audience if I told you that this summer I had a group of interns doing some research for me. And for the very first time, Alex, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the city of Detroit, the health department, has put all of the health inspections for restaurants, food retail online. So that's public knowledge. It's public information, correct? So what I did was I asked these interns if they could download onto an Excel spreadsheet all of the food retail and all of the restaurants from the city of Detroit's health departments, so that I know not only what restaurants and what food retail has been inspected by the city, but what's forthcoming, because they have to fill out an application so that a health inspector can inspect their building. And I didn't really care about what kind of restaurant it is. What I cared about was the zip code. What I cared about was where these food retail establishments were located. And so they downloaded thousands of entries and they were able to cross-reference the zip code. Then they cross-referenced the zip code to the corresponding neighborhood. And would it surprise folks in the room if I told you that 53% of all food retail in the city of Detroit is in downtown and midtown Detroit, right? And so what that tells me is that we have a problem in the city of Detroit as it relates to who is even navigating the systems in order to even start the process and procedures in terms of opening up a restaurant and retail. Like, what does that look like? I would say that the folks who are opening up retail in downtown and midtown, and even the demographic in downtown and midtown, tends to be white. That's only 7.2 square miles. Detroit has 140. So what about the other 137 square miles of the city of Detroit? And I'll tell you, and so this really gets into the weeds. And you ask yourself, how is it that 7.2 square miles in the city has 53% of all food retail? What's needed to open up a food retail? And so the first thing you need is you have to know how to navigate city government. And for those individuals that are opening up in downtown and midtown, in many cases, they have a consultant that is working with them, standing in line at city government departments, working with developers who have relationships with folks in the city who could fast track their paperwork. Where if you are an entrepreneur that's trying to open up a business, you don't have that kind of access to that talent, to the skill set, to a consultant who can stand in line and help navigate paperwork for you. Then you have to ask yourself, okay, so there's a problem in terms of getting through the barriers of even accessing the paperwork so I can be properly licensed, having a health inspector. Then you have to ask yourself the second question, capital. How much money do I need to open up a retail restaurant? I can tell folks right now that the entrepreneurs that I've worked with, the going rate of opening up a restaurant in the city of Detroit is about $500,000 to $700,000. That's how much it's costing, right? Who has that type of money? And so here's the reality, and then I'm going to give it to Cami or Baba Malik, is that here's what I've seen in my experience. Have entrepreneurs of color open up these restaurants upwards to $500,000, maybe $600,000? Yes, they have. How have they done it? Well, there's a lot of programs that are within the city of Detroit. You've got something that's called Motor City Match. You've got something that's called the Entrepreneurs of Color Fund that's sponsored by the Kellogg Foundation, I think in JP Morgan Chase. You have pitch competitions, Hatch Detroit, demo days. You've got micro loan funds, right, through Prosper Us. You've got friends and family. You've got crowdsourcing. You've got GoFundMe. And in many cases, entrepreneurs of color are doing what's called capital stacking, using all these different types of resources. They're using 5 and 6 different types of methodologies to open up a restaurant. Where you have white entrepreneurs, and you know how many they're using? 1. You want to know why? Because they tend to have an investor. They tend to be working with a developer that will float their restaurant business. And the only thing they have to worry about is working with one individual, whether that's an equity partner, whether that's an investor, whether that's a developer. So there's an imbalance of how capital is being raised in the city. And that's a problem. Because if I'm a Black entrepreneur opening up my restaurant and my capital stack consists of 7 sources of funding, I've got to worry with now how I'm going to pay all of that back, right? And then I have to worry about how I'm going to piece the puzzles together in order to get access to all of that. And so those are just a few examples of where I see there is a tremendous imbalance, even when we talk about access.
Yeah, no, so staying on that theme of imbalance, I want to share a paradox of agriculture in Detroit. There's a great organization called Keep Growing Detroit, and I would rather have them say all of this. So I don't pretend to be a spokesperson for them, but I want to share some research that they have come up with. They have 1,500 members. It's an organization, growers in the organization. And part of that, they offer a program called Grown in Detroit, which is a group of market gardeners. So people look at urban agriculture in Detroit. Thank you. People look at urban agriculture in Detroit and say, you have all this land and you have all these great organizations. Well, agriculture should be a great tool for economic development. And yes, there are. This is a very sophisticated form of engaging in the economy. The growers who are participating in the circle make about $1,000 to supplement their income annually, and they're growing about $1 million worth in terms of the produce that's exchanged in the marketplace. The capacity could be a lot more. The analysis that they have made is that with 5,000 acres in Detroit, you could grow all the fruits and vegetables that are consumed in the city of Detroit. So there are possibilities in Detroit, and there are many people who want to grow food and sell it and make some money, but they also have a goal of increasing access to fresh fruits and vegetables in their neighborhoods, which means that they cannot sell, right? If they want to keep the food affordable, but they also want to make the money, it's not an equation that can be squared. You can't do it. And so that's the paradox, is you can't have cheap food and still pay growers a wage that actually is livable. So that's not a paradox for them. It's a paradox for all of us. And so if you're going to look at sovereignty, then you have to say support producers, support everyone who has a role in putting food on the table with what they need, not just wages, everything that they need, livelihoods, benefits, etc., working conditions. And that has to be a priority for all of us. And everyone should also have some knowledge about growing food, even if they may choose not to. But so in Detroit, there's actually money available if you want to start a garden. And there are people who will say, start a garden, but the expectation is that once you have the startup funds, that you then sustain it yourself. And that's a real challenge. As hard as it is to start a garden, sustaining a garden, with all the labor that is involved and the organizing that's involved and providing the benefits, takes money. And that money is really hard to come by. And if we want healthy, sustainably produced local food, then we need to figure out, and that produces other kinds of benefits, right? So it cleans up the neighborhood, it diverts stormwater from going into the storm sewers, there's microhabitats for bees, birds. These are all benefits that sustainable production produces both in the city and in rural areas, and we need to figure out how to support that.
I just wanted to make one comment before I let Baba Malik have the last word on this. And I want to widen out the lens a little bit, Cammie. And I want to make one note that I think is super important. So if we're talking about access and opportunity, and so Food Lab works very closely with Keep Growing Detroit. They're one of our most trusted partners, and we love working with them. And I talk with the leadership at Keep Growing Detroit all the time about this problem. And so you're right, there are over now 1,600 farms and gardens in the city of Detroit. But I want to be very clear that folks understand what that looks like. And so the largest percentage of farms and gardens in the city of Detroit, probably close to 80%, are backyard gardens, right? Individuals growing in their backyard. The second largest is probably our community gardens and then our school gardens. But most importantly, and the very small percent, is market gardens. And market gardens and farms are folks that are using farming as an economic development tool, meaning they want to grow in order to sell their produce to the market. Here's the problem. And so we can solve for access. And Keep Growing Detroit does that by aggregating fruits and vegetables from those individual kind of backyard gardens I was talking about earlier that individuals are growing under the banner of what they call Keep or Grown in Detroit, GID. And they sell it at Eastern Market and other farmers markets and returns 100% of the proceeds back to those farmers, 100%. That's great, that's access. But where the problem comes in is opportunity. And what I mean by that is that if you take a look at those farmers and growers that are individual growers who are trying to get to market garden, along the trajectory, you might have a lot of Black folks that are farming and growing on the individual level, but when it becomes scalable and trying to grow your garden or your farm to the market garden, it then becomes majority white. So where is the problem? Where is the disconnect that we got a lot of folks up at the top and we don't have a pipeline at all? We have what's called a funnel, where as folks are growing or even starting restaurants. I had a lot of Black and brown folks in my program as a part of Food Lab that are culinarians, that are cooks, that are cooking out of their homes. But there's no pipeline, there's a funnel. Because those that make it through and able to open up a restaurant or start a food truck tend to be non-Black folks. And so I think that there is a gap between access and opportunity as it relates to race. And to your point, Baba Malik, in the city of Detroit, you cannot separate race and resources.
Again, it's an honor. I almost feel like I don't need to say anything because these two sisters are so brilliant. But I'll try to maybe add just a little to what they've said. I know a little about farming in Detroit because I manage the largest farm in the city. Um, and I'll just say that in general in America, farming is not really economically sustainable without subsidies. Most farms, most large farms, large rural farms, get subsidies which allow them to survive. most rural farmers have to work a second job outside of the farm just to keep the farm alive. So while this problem might be concentrated in Detroit or in urban areas, it's not unique to urban areas. There's a problem with how our value of food and the people who produce it and the food system generally. And so all of the food that we're consuming in the United States is artificially low priced. We're not really paying the true price of the food. A lot of that has to do with the exploitation of workers. It has to do with the externalization of various costs, environmental costs, for example. And so, so we have to really change our minds in terms of how we value food and begin to pay the true cost for food so that the people who are producing the food can be paid a livable wage. But I also want to talk about access to capital. So in addition to running D-Town Farm, we've been working now for 9 years on a project. We first started, we decided we wanted to do a food co-op because we think that within the context of a capitalist system, that a co-op is the best way to galvanize collective community wealth and to build community power and to build a sense of democracy among people, as opposed to the kind of typical solutions that we hear for places like Detroit, which is to get a major national retailer to come in, and then we see that as progress when we can go and spend our money in these places, and for the most part, the money is extracted. There might be some money that stays in the community from the jobs that are created, but for the most part, that money is not circulated within our communities. So we started knowing we wanted to develop a food co-op, but as the project continued and the idea became more flushed out, we realized that what we want is something more than just a food co-op, but it's really kind of a hub of sorts of food activity. And we have to build a building that is going to accommodate that because there aren't existing buildings on the main avenue that we want to build, Woodward Avenue, and in the area of the city that we want to build. So we're building a $14 million building called the Detroit Food Commons, just about maybe 3/4 of a mile from here on Woodward and Euclid. And so as we've been stacking the capital from multiple sources, that is rain. As we've been stacking the capital from multiple sources, what we find is that capitalism is a self-replicating system. In other words, if you want to borrow, let's say $1 million from a bank or from a CDFI or some other financial institution, you essentially already have to have $1 million or something worth $1 million or somebody to step in on your behalf who has $1 million, because the lender is not going to lose their money. If you default on the loan, they're going to get it from somewhere. And so what that means is that those who already have access to capital have greater access to capital. Those who don't have a pot of money to begin with are deemed capital unready. They don't have the prerequisites in place to go to these lending institutions and to get the money that's needed to build these establishments. We see a similar scenario playing out in the nonprofit world, but in the nonprofit world, they use the word capacity. And so what we find is that we have larger, more well-established, usually white-led nonprofits who are deemed to have greater capacity. And so as funders are deciding who they're going to give larger grants to, invariably what happens is that these larger, more well-established, white-led nonprofits are first in line to get the larger chunks of money. And what that does is it gives them even more capacity, so that when the next grant comes in and the funder looks to see who has capacity, of course, the people who got, the money last time and were able to build their capacity have more. So it's a self-replicating system. And so it's our view, really, that as we're talking about creating food sovereignty and food justice and food security, that we have to really disrupt in a fundamental way the power relationships in American society. We have to disrupt the economic relationships and disrupt the ownership of land and have a fundamental shift. We're not for like this kind of incremental window dressing, where, we have a bit here and a bit here. But in order to really create equity, we have to fundamentally redistribute wealth in America. And we think that one of the ways to do that is through reparations. There's a lot of discussions about what that might look like, and I don't want to get into, the various scenarios of what that might look like, but we need a massive redistribution of wealth, because if we don't have that, we'll continue to see the same vast inequity in who holds wealth in American society, which is defined in many ways based upon so-called race.
Thank you. That makes me think of last summer I was at a meeting. It was supposed to be a convening of leaders in Detroit's food system to come up with solutions for how we were going to keep people fed and healthy. And the majority of people looked like me. The people who run the nonprofits and the organizations are predominantly white. And there happened to be one African-American woman in the room from the state health department, and she said, "Why are we talking about building a food system just for poor black people?" Because we were in the room talking about SNAP food stamps, nutrition incentives, food pantries, but we were not talking at all. We were talking about that access that generally those nonprofits are talking about, but we weren't talking about sovereignty and how to get people the power, the choice to do it themselves. So for your organizations, how are you helping people build sovereignty and reach, get their power?
And so, I think there's a lot of tension that I hold in my heart because the way Food Lab is described to funders, we describe ourselves as a food incubator. And what that means is that we provide folks with the business education and the technical assistance to get them capital ready so they can grow and they can scale. I'm using these words, right, what folks like to hear: growth and scale businesses. And so there is this tension in many cases, because at the end of the day, what I do know in my heart is that, to Malik's point, these systems are being replicated. And if I'm to assist entrepreneurs, who in many cases are black and brown entrepreneurs, who are not poor at all, they lack resources, yes, but they're full of rich ideas. And it's because they live in their communities every day. And they know what the problem is. And in many cases, they have the solutions. What they don't have is the resources. And so there's this tension that I hold in my heart, because I say one thing, but in actuality, I'm doing something totally different. And that is that I have to think about, how am I designing my programming? I have to think about, how am I satisfying the deliverables that I have to give to my grantors, but doing something that is so vital and that is important, and that is building community, and that is building a movement, and that is organizing. And in that, I am trying to teach the importance of empowerment and what that looks like. And so when Malik talks about disruption, we have to think about business models that don't replicate those systems. And one of the things that we're working on is a all-day cafe that Food Lab would run in partnership with Allied Media, called the Dream Cafe, that will purport all the values that we try to teach our entrepreneurs. And we're really thinking about this cafe being a worker-owned cooperative, right? But here's the thing that's so important when we start talking about cooperatives in terms of how I look at that. I have to re-engineer, and I have to really think about what a worker-owned cooperative looks like. And what that means is that, how am I setting my entrepreneurs up for a cooperative where they have to come together and do governance as a community? They have to practice democracy as a cooperative. They have to make decisions collectively. And a lot of times what that boils down to is trust. And so while I may be describing Food Lab Detroit as this incubator that's helping folks grow and scale and launch and get capital ready to open businesses, What I'm really doing is creating a platform that entrepreneurs can plug into to get to know one another, build relationships with one another, and build trust with one another. So at the end of the day, they're not opening up that restaurant by themselves. That they have met someone in the Food Lab community, that instead of doing it alone, let's do it together. And so I'm really trying to shift the paradigm where folks don't look at themselves as that they have to be solo entrepreneurs or they have to be the ones that's doing it by themselves, but they are really looking at how can I build a team that I trust so that perhaps we can go in on a building and do this together instead of me doing it alone. And so those are some of the things that I'm thinking about at Food Lab.
I've taken the microphone, but I really don't have an answer. As a planner, I'm looking to planners both in city government as well as in the community to see, how we can bring planning tools to increasing access, building capacity at the community level, building lifting up community-based solutions. And in some respects, we have gone the other way. So, for example, a lot of the gardens, many of the gardens that don't happen in the backyard, happen because people are squatting on land that happens to be vacant nearby. And for the longest time, they just did it, and the city didn't, urban agriculture was illegal. And now we have an urban agriculture ordinance, and it's great. It's very permissive of growing in practically every kind of district that the zoning code recognizes. But the whole process of formalizing urban agriculture really came about because of the fact that there was this businessman who wanted the city to give him thousands of lots, just give it to him so that he would develop a farm to grow food to feed the hungry people of Detroit. And that was really a big impetus because there was the need to then figure out how to regulate agriculture. So I guess the point I'm making is the tools that we have are tools that are in service to capitalism, whether that's the market related to land or the market related to starting a business. And it's a huge challenge, and that's why I'm grateful to be with these stars because the typical institutions don't work for these alternative ways of thinking about sovereignty or access.
So the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network is building food sovereignty through, first, as Devita said, building community. In many ways, oppression takes apart the fabric of a community. And so if you have a community that's been decimated, it's very hard to build the institutions that are necessary within that community to serve it. And I've also learned that that's not an instant process, and that's something sometimes that funders, I don't think, understand. They're looking for, deliverables within a year or 2 years. This is a protracted process. It takes years and years and decades to kind of re-knit back together that fabric where you have a community of people that understand the need to support these institutions. So that's the first thing that we're doing. The second way that we're building food sovereignty is by the way that we frame our work. Our organization is not a reformist organization. We're a revolutionary organization. Frankly, we don't believe that within the context of the current American political and economic system that Black people can be free. But this is where we are now, but it's important that we get people thinking beyond that. What would a post-capitalist society look like? What would a society look like that didn't see the earth as simply a commodity? And to get people to think outside of that box. And so our framing of things as being anti-capitalist, anti the system of white supremacy, anti-patriarchal, and pro-community, pro-democracy, pro the earth. that framing is a very important way that we help to build sovereignty as well. And then I would say the third thing has to do with our emphasis on young people. When I was a younger activist in the late 1960s and early 1970s, we were very short-sighted, and we thought that this process of social change was almost instantaneous. And so those of us who've matured within the movement understand that not only is it a protracted process, but it's an intergenerational process. And so as we think about food and the food system and the food movement, not only do the methods that we use to produce the food have to be sustainable, but the movement itself has to be sustainable. So we have to intentionally nurture young people who see themselves as having an investment in the food system and see themselves as being advocates for their own community, and not just advocates, but shapers really of the food system that impacts their community. So those are the main ways we're building sovereignty.
So I think we just have a little bit of time left, but I wanted to have you all think about, well, you all have already done a great job of kind of highlighting a lot of the issues around food in Detroit, and Detroit is often framed, especially around food, and in terms of deficits, not enough grocery stores, not enough fresh produce, not enough whatever. But I'd like you to talk about some of the unintended benefits, some of the real positives that you've seen come out of the work that you're doing.
Maybe I'll go first this time. So at the root of this work for us is really shifting our consciousness and becoming more human. And so I'll just reflect on an event that we had this past weekend at our farm. We had our 13th annual Harvest Festival, and hundreds of people come out to that. And I was able to witness children and adults reconnecting with the earth. And that might seem like a simple thing, but most of us live most of our lives in buildings and on concrete, and we're very much disconnected, not only from the food system, but we're disconnected from nature in general. And so one of the, I don't know if it's an unintended consequence, but one of the consequences which perhaps is not talked about as the main kind of objective is this reconnecting people with nature. And really what we're doing is we're becoming more fully human. And so if we are limited in our understanding of what it means to be a human being, then the systems that we create will also reflect that limitation. So to the extent that we can develop our own humanity and our own souls, we're capable of developing systems that reflect that higher consciousness and reflect an understanding of the unity of humanity, but also reflect an understanding of the essential unity of human beings with the animals and plants that we share the planet with and the planet itself.
On a more extremely mundane level, this is, what is a great benefit or outcome in my world, which is the university education world, is to see students really seeing the community as a source of solution and inspiration and leadership. In planning, when we try to engage our students and get them out into the community, and it's very important for us. When they come in, a lot of our students come from the suburbs, and they're sometimes coming into inner city neighborhoods for the first time. And they think that because they've learned some things in class that they might have solutions, but you see the shift and you see them learning, both when leaders come into our classroom and when our students do projects in the community. And to me, that's a transformation that is very just awesome.
So there was a sign, I don't know if you guys saw it, that we can do 2 minutes of Q&A. And so I'm going to say this very quickly in terms of some of the unintended consequences, some of the things that bring me joy. I was asked a while ago, sitting on a panel, this person said, Devita, what do you hope for in the city of Detroit? And I said this because right now where I am in my life, I'm a part of something that's called the sandwich generation. I'm right in the middle. My brother just had a baby. My niece is 3 years old. Her name is Aliyah. And my mother and father are in their sunset years. They're dying. Not today, not tomorrow, but they're aging. And so when I thought about that question, I thought, I want to live in a city that honors its elders and loves its children. That's important to me. And I think where I see that play out most has to be in the farms and gardens in the city of Detroit. This intergenerational connection between our young folks and our elders. And that's important to me because my niece won't have a direct connection to the South like my brother and I had. I'm a first generation Detroiter. My mother and father were a part of what was called the Great Migration. They migrated from rural Alabama to Detroit. And I always had a connection to the South because every year until I was about 17, mommy and daddy took me and my brother back to what they call home. We went home. My niece won't have that because her mother and father are from the North. And so I think it's really important as my mother now was sitting in her gardens with her, telling her about black-eyed peas and okra and sweet potato, because that is a part of our heritage. And what is really lovely is what I see on a more professional level, that there are now black chefs that are not running away from soul food anywhere more. They aren't running away from our food ways and trying to cook Italian food or French food. They are putting beautiful Southern soul food on the plate, whether that be Marshama Bailey down at the Gray in Charleston, South Carolina, or Eric Williams at Virtude in Chicago, Eduardo Jordan at June Baby in Seattle. I mention them because they all are James Beard Michelin star winning chefs. That is important. It is because our young people say, if Marshama can do it, so can I. If Eduardo can do it, so can I. And the importance of our young people seeing farmers and chefs that are being highlighted in mainstream media, that is important. Because if they could do it, I can do it. And that continues the tradition and the legacy of the cuisine of my ancestors.
Thank you. Yeah. Round of applause for our panel. Excellent. I think now we're moving into Q&A time.
Hello, panel. You guys have done a great job. My name is Whitley Granberry, and I'm an attorney with the Detroit Justice Center. And I've just moved into the role from being what I would say a more general lawyer into a movement lawyer. And I'm focusing on worker-owned co-ops. And the question is, I find that in starting co-ops here in the city, we have a lot of people who don't even know what co-ops are, right? So we're doing a lot of public education at the same time. How do you guys reconcile finding mechanisms that you think are good solutions in helping and furthering and maintaining and sustaining healthy Black communities and also furthering the movement? Because you can't do this type of lawyering, for me, for example, without the movement, right? So I found now that I think my focus is shifting more on how to support the movement, because you can't do the lawyering without the movement, right? So we have co-ops. I'm a member of Detroit People's Food Co-op. Like we have co-ops that we're trying to start, but we don't have enough people who are familiar with the idea yet, I think, to help with the financing, because we want to finance it ourselves to have it exist and build ourselves. How are you reconciling the movement perhaps being a step behind the businesses that we're trying to start in terms of the co-ops? And the worker-owned co-op that you are trying to start in the Devita, I think in the Love Building, right? Yeah. So I know that's kind of a complicated question, but.
Yeah, so I want to be really cognizant of time, and so I'm going to answer that question rather quickly from my standpoint. And so we will not be opening up Dream Cafe in the Love Building, which is the building that is owned by Allied Media Projects. Mama Neza from Natural Paradise Food is going to do, I do believe is going to be the operator of that space, but we're looking possibly at being nearby. So I will say thank you so much for your work. And I will say this too. I think it is Margot and B. Anthony from the Detroit Community Wealth Fund that's starting to do a lot of education, community outreach, and awareness. And so I think that none of this is going to happen overnight. And how do I reconcile with it? I reconcile with it because I have decided a long time ago, I have come to the conclusion that the work that I'm doing, maybe even the work that Baba Malik is doing, I won't see the full fruition of that work in my lifetime. I will not. And so I reconcile with it because I believe that I have certain privileges. And that privilege for me is that I'm really thinking about what our work looks like and the impact of our work 50 years from now, 75 years from now. I'm planning so that I can leave a better world for my niece's children's children. And understanding that, how I reconcile is that I am going to be a part of what I call infrastructure building. That's what I'm doing. I'm building infrastructure with the help of folks like a Margot and people like B. Anthony who are bringing the education. My job is to raise awareness, to maybe see models, but it's also my job to pass the torch so we can then execute upon the infrastructure that I help create. So that's how I reconcile with it, Baba.
So first, also I'm a fan of the Detroit Justice Center. Desiree Ferguson is a very good friend of mine for decades. Thank you for the tremendous work that's being done there. So for me, for the organization I represent, there's no difference between movement work and this co-op that we're developing. It's part and parcel of the same thing. But what we've had to do and what we continue to do is intense community engagement, because there is a generation of Black folks who have not been exposed to what co-ops are. Although we have this rich legacy, and many people are familiar with the book Collective Courage by Jessica Gordon Nimhart that chronicles this great history of Black people participating in co-ops. In fact, much of her work actually builds on the work of the African-American scholar W.E.B. Du Bois. So we've had this history, but we've had kind of a broken an interruption of that history. So there's many people now who are not familiar with co-ops. So intense community engagement and community education is part of what we're doing in order to get the support. If folks don't know what a co-op is, they're not going to support it.
Hello there. You mentioned in a couple different ways how whites coming to the city get to work with developers and to snatch up a lot of the restaurant opportunities. What different things, if at all, is the city government doing to assist legacy Detroiters and people of color in the city in competing against this tidal wave of newcomers?
You know, I mean, if I mean, I guess I think the city would think that programs like a Motor City Match is something that they're doing. And what Motor City Match is, it is a program that's funded through, I want to say, I think is, but the host who holds the program is the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation. But I think the money that is funding Motor City Match, I think is CBGB money. I think it's community block grant money from the federal government, right? So I think that what the city would say is that they have used or are using federal dollars to help support entrepreneurs through various different programs, right? But that's a slow go. And in many cases, I guess even though the government, they need to have some accountability, I think that's important. I think the thing that they need to be really super focused on, because as I'm working with entrepreneurs every day at Food Lab, and even if we are able to stack the capital needed for them to open up restaurants, the thing that they are most concerned about, of course, is customers. They're concerned with density. What I need the city to be really laser focused on is residential housing. I need the city to be focused on making sure we have safe, dense, populated communities. Because quite honestly, folks who I work with want to open up restaurants in their neighborhood, but they also know that they want these neighborhoods to be walkable neighborhoods, right? So I don't think that there's too many neighborhoods that you can go into the city of Detroit. I'm sure there are, but there's a tremendous amount of neighborhoods right now that are under construction. As we speak, Detroit, Michigan is going through the largest transformation that we will ever see, at least in my lifetime, because neighborhoods are physically changing. So we see a lot of construction. So it is important for the government to be able to lay infrastructure to take care of common areas like safety, infrastructure, street lights. And I think those are some of the things, making sure that Detroiters could stay in their homes. I mean, I'm speaking as a legacy and native Detroiter, right? And I'm very clear on how my parents were able to build wealth. The wealth that afforded me and my brother to go to private school and then go to university. My parents accumulated wealth because in 1967, they had the opportunity to buy their first home on the northwest side of Detroit on Ohio Street. That's how they began to build wealth. And at one point in time, and I was born in 1969, and at one point in time, the city of Detroit, an experiment as it was for single family housing, the city of Detroit had the most African American home ownership in the world. In the world. Do you know what that means? Is that we were on a trajectory. There was a window of opportunity of about probably 10 years where African Americans started to build wealth. But if we know our history, Malik, we know that as Black folks in this country take one step forward, that white supremacy and institutional and systematic racism is going to push us 15 steps backwards, right? And so what I need for the government to do is to put forth anti-racist, anti-Black policies that allow Black folks in this city to start to accumulate wealth. And for me in my lifetime, that looked like home ownership and like business ownership, right? Malik, you want to have the last word?
Question?
Is there one? I think that's it.
That's it? Okay.
We got the signal to round.